All right, this is our second lesson on classical China, and what we're going to focus on here are the schools of thought, as we like to term them, because they're not just all three philosophies or they're not all three religions, but they are instrumental in shaping the way the Chinese people think and live their lives. So we're going to talk about all three here, and then we'll see how they interweave within the political and cultural structure of China here in a little bit. So first I want to talk about legalism. Now, first of all, just one of those tips for you. Anytime you see ism at the end of a word, that means it's a belief in something. And so this is a belief in a certain legal structure for running society within China. And legalism, our textbook only gives it one paragraph, so I want to talk about it here a little bit. Basically, the state is number one. The health of the state, the status of the state, the people buying into the state, i.e. the government, is the first priority. And this makes sense that this was legalism proved to be the thing that got China from its warring states period into its first dynasty in 200 years with the Qin dynasty. But when we talk about the state coming first, we mean that. That means anything that we would consider like personal liberties, freedoms, those things get squashed if it means impeding the progress of the state or the health of the state. So it's ruthless. The ends justify the means. Those of you who maybe are familiar with European history, more recent European history, and know about Machiavelli or Machiavellian politics, this is very similar to that. As a matter of fact, some historians believe Machiavelli was influenced by legalist principles in constructing his worldview about how things should be. So, in order to keep people on the up and up, you have strict punishment for people who violate the law. And there's this idea of collective responsibility that there is, no putting your head down and ignoring things that are going on. You play your part in society as well. The two strengths of the state, the two things you want to make sure that are always doing well for the state are its agriculture, because you end up with, if you end up with famine, you end up with angry people or dead people or both. And the military must always be strong. The military for the purpose of self-preservation from enemies, as well as self-preservation from maybe people who defy the government. So these are always two things. We see the whole thing with agriculture being important to most societies, and that's because it's the key thing that allows the society to function. There's a term that you kids are probably aware of, hangry, H-A-N-G-R-Y. It's when you're hungry, and that causes you to be angry. And so there's a saying among historians that hangry people lead to destruction of the government. Anyway, they want to make sure the peasants and the soldiers obviously are happy and healthy, because the peasants are the one doing the agriculture, and of course the soldiers are the one making up the military. So who in the society is not valued? Intellectuals, people who are about artistic and intellectual endeavors. What purpose do you serve for strengthening the state is what they basically say. And so those people end up with, on the outside looking in, as legalist doctrine was at the forefront. Fortunately for those who were of the artistic or intellectual ilk, the legalist doctrine loses its sway as the Qin dynasty is overthrown. The other two schools of thought are going to come to the forefront as the Qin dynasty fades away and the Han dynasty comes along. So we take a look at Confucius. The very first day of school, if I had asked you to name, 5 people in history who weren't European or American, most of you probably could name Confucius. He's one of the most famous people in history, and he's been referenced in pop culture many, many times. But what was interesting about Confucius, despite his fame, and during his life, he sought notoriety. He was trying to be noticed, is that Confucius died without anyone really knowing about him or paying attention to him. The old thing about Confucius say, well, that didn't exist during his lifetime. He was a government official. He had a background as being an aristocrat, so it wasn't like he was ever poor or anything. He was a man of principle. He was unwilling to compromise on principle. And basically he lived during the period of warring states, as you can see by the dates here. And he was constantly going around he would go from region to region, telling the rulers his philosophy on life, on morals, on how to rule, and trying to basically get a job with that particular leader. And he just kept getting the door slammed in his face. And so after all these decades of wandering and being unemployed, essentially, he returns home and eventually dies. Now, fortunately for Confucius, his stuff had been written down, and others, after his death, end up buying into it. And so in the Analects, we see most of Confucius's ideas. Just to touch on a couple of things here, Confucius was about trying to help solve and strengthen social and political problems. He did not deal with religion. He felt it went beyond the capacity of mortal human intelligence. So he focused on ethics, on politics, and that was where most of his ideas went. He believed in a principle called Zhenzi, which basically means superior individuals, people who are well educated, extraordinarily conscientious. They should be the people that run a country. They're the best people to have in a government. The most important thing they could have, the most important skill they could offer or trait they could offer was moral integrity. The ability to be wise and fair in your judgment. And these are the type of people Confucius wanted to have power. Some of the Confucian values worth noting. It gives you an idea of what the overall teachings are about. You have Ren, which deals with being kind and benevolent toward people, people who are courteous and loyal. That's something you want in your leaders, in your government officials. Li translates to something we call propriety, which is behaving in an appropriate fashion. Treat people with courtesy. Show respect to your elders or your superiors. That's going to be a key thing we see in Chinese history and Confucian values. And he believes that the practice of Ren and Li are key to an orderly society. So is the notion of filial piety, the respect of not only your elders, but also of your ancestors. And we're going to see ancestor veneration, respect for the dead, and the way they live their lives is important. So all of this, if you can practice Ren, Li, and Xiao, filial piety, then you have all the traits that make you a superior individual. And you are one of the key people to help with an orderly society. One thing to note is that Confucianists, however, were very patriarchal. So it's still all about the guys. Sorry, ladies. Then we come to Taoism. This is a religion. It emerges at roughly the same time as Confucianism does. And basically, this is a pretty chill religion. We might call it a hippie religion in our way. And his founder was Lao Tzu. And you see, he's much earlier than most people. So during his lifetime, it wasn't a religion of many people. It doesn't get much of a following until later. But Taoism means the way of the way of nature, the way of the cosmos. And it's going to be pretty influential after a while. So the doctrine of Wu Wei, one of the early people who espoused Taoism, the idea here is that we need to be in one with nature. People do. If you try to control the universe, i.e., build a dam or a canal, well, you're messing with nature, and all that's going to do is result in chaos, at least according to this. So you need to disengage. You need to be one with nature. So that means there's no reason to have this advanced education. There's no reason to be an ambitious person. A simple life is where you need to go. You need to know yourself. Don't worry about anything else or anybody else. and less government is better. So you can see this is completely at odds with legalism, and it's even at odds with Confucianism too, to some degree. So what you're going to end up with is Taoism, ironically, despite being at odds with those two, actually ends up becoming popular. The implications here is that people were Confucianist in public in how they behaved, but Taoism was how you were at home. So it's almost like being one way in public, but your real belief system for how you handled yourself was different at home. So intellectual people, as they come to the forefront during the Han Dynasty, are able to embrace both, despite them being at odds in certain ways. The Han Dynasty itself, which we'll be talking about in the next lesson, accepted both because both were useful to them. Confucianism was useful because it was a great way to put the best people in positions of leadership. It was a great way to organize society, keep society orderly. And Taoist priests were convinced to praise the Han emperor. So why would they squash a religion where they're actually telling their subjects, the people they preach to, hey, the Han emperor is great. Follow him, listen to him. So they're going to be really supportive of that. Okay, in our next lesson, we're going to focus on the Han Dynasty, one of the most important dynasties in Chinese history, and we'll see their social, political, economic traits and why they're so important.